So at school I was taught it's Muslims killing Jews. I was sold the biggest lie ever, that this is a war between religions. I was presented things that way, that the Holocaust survivors finally got their promised land. But there was these bloody Muslims, just like at the times of the Crusades, who were just thirsty for blood. But it doesn't take very long to notice that the attacks of the Israeli army affect equally Muslims and Christians living in Palestine. And you even got the IDF and the Israeli police being violent against Jews who oppose the occupation. I grew up in a family that didn't like Arabs, Muslims, black people, and I was taught at school that in Palestine, everyone, even the kids, were terrorists. So when I see so many hate comments online, I see myself, my former self, and I see my parents. I understand where it comes from. But eventually, our minds have changed. I mean, my parents, not too much, but it's getting there. The question is, how is it possible for people to change from hate to having a more nuanced point of view? We need to look at the works of Solomon Asch in the 1950s about peer pressure and conformity. He made social experiments just like Milgram, and one of these experiments where if you are with a group of people in a room and everyone apart from you in the room say the same thing, you are more likely to believe what everyone says, even if they're completely wrong.
It examines behavior under the pressure of social forces, as the experiment of Solomon Asch reveals. The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
And it becomes worse if these people are figures of authority. So you can imagine what happens when you have government officials, the media, telling you that if you oppose the ceasefire, then you support terrorism, then you support hate. If you support peace, then you spread hatred. How does it even make sense? Of course, it's completely absurd. But because it is high-ranking politicians saying that, our mind believes that, hold on a second, I might be careful before I advocate for peace because, the police can come and knock on my door. Do you get how vicious it is? Literally saying peace is bad. But then why such a heightened reaction? If you're a healthy and balanced person and you see someone you disagree with, and someone who is not willing to engage in a conversation to understand, so what do? If you're balanced and healthy, you just ignore them, you dismiss them because, you're not going to waste your time and energy, right? But when I looked at the comments under my video about the Natura Carta, I thought there's such a small group, a powerless group with no influence. And instead of people dismissing them as crazy and not engaging in further, what they do is they make an extra effort to type really, really mean comments about them. So how can people react so violently against people who have no power and are not even trying to hurt them? And this has to do with something called the in and out group theory. And the most basic illustration of that is what happens during football matches. So a researcher called Taijfel and colleagues worked on social identity in the 1970s and came out with this theory. It says that the human mind, as a survival mechanism, feels threatened by things we perceive as being outsiders. And on the other hand, we tend to stick to people we can identify with. So what happens is at some point, the brain cuts off all the circuits about empathy and identify this other as an enemy. They are not relatable anymore. They are someone to defeat. They are something. They are animals, as some people may say. And there is no coincidence that amongst the most vocal ultra-nationalist movements, you have lots of football supporters. Because they're already very familiar with this in and out theory in their brains. And this is how people are able to instrumentalize religion, which means to summon the attachment people have to the symbols that represent religion, this emotional attachment to form a group mindset and distort the religion to make them hate anyone who is outside of this group. This is how, for example, ISIS would distort Islam to justify their unjustifiable actions. This is how the Buddhists in Myanmar justify the genocide against the Rohingya. And this is how Israeli officials, although completely secular, they don't care about religion. They would weaponize Judaism to justify the killing of civilians.
זכור את אשר עשה לך עמלק, נצטווינו. אנו זוכרים ואנו נלחמים.
So it's basically a marketing strategy. You throw symbols and buzzwords and you repeat it enough so people believe it. And you essentialize things. You simplify things. Instead of talking about geostrategy, financial interests, natural resources, society, you brand it as a conflict between religions, between Islam and Judaism. Even further, you say it's a battle between good and evil.
Israel is fighting the enemies of civilization itself. It begins with knowing the difference between good and evil.
And you dehumanize them. And this is one of the first steps of genocide. And it's been proven by multiple agencies that this kind of language violates the genocide's conventions. And this is how you've got people who are high-ranking American officials or Israeli officials who think that it's perfectly fine to call for the murder of children.
It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true.
I'm very puzzled by the constant concern which the world and also Britain, I must say, Mark, is showing for the Palestinian people, and is actually showing for these horrible, inhuman animals.
أنا لا أسويهم بالحيوانات لأن هذا تحقير للحيوانات.
תכסחו אותם כמה שיותר, שלא להשאיר מהם זכר. שלא הם, לא אמא שלהם, לא הילדה שלהם, לא התינוקות שלהם. אסור להם לחיות לחיות האלה.
We are at 10,000 dead Palestinians. How many will be enough? One of my colleagues just said all of them.
Representative Angie Nixon was giving a speech during a House session. As she was speaking, a voice shouted out, all of them. Nixon identified that speaker as Michelle Salzman. Northwest Florida Representative Alex Andrade confirmed he heard Salzman's response to Nixon.
They criticize Hamas, but I don't know if they realize that they're basically advocating for what they criticize the most. And one big difference is, Hamas is a militant group. They do not brand themselves as the only democracy in the Middle East or the beacon of civilization and so on. My next question is then, why are people deaf to reason, to facts and figures? And that's because when you summon symbolism, it's something which is very emotional. It's not rational anymore. And this is why you can argue whatever you want and people would not move their position. And humans are, I would say, a bit reluctant to change. We are very happy in our comfort zones, and we don't like, stepping outside of it unless you're an extreme sports athlete or you're a philosopher. And ironically, things become worse if someone from your own perceived group says the opposite. And we've seen many of them, Orthodox and secular Jews criticizing the actions of the Israeli government. And these are the people who always receive the most hate. And the hate from whom? From people who identify as Jewish.
My fellow Jews, we need to talk. And heads up, this will be necessarily uncomfortable for us both. Really, government has been oppressing Palestinians all this time. And here's the important part. While hiding behind the shield of Judaism and the Shoah.
And this is because in the mind of people, they become monsters. And to understand monsters, just like the monsters in science fiction, it is entities that are roughly similar to us, to human beings, but somehow too different at the same time, and the brain cannot compute. If you look at, in the history of science fictions, the scariest monsters ever produced, you will notice they always have humanoid features. So an element of relatability, but there's always something off, whether it is their facial features, their behavior, their body, and anything. And the clash between similarity and difference is just so much that the brain has this very heightened reaction. And this is why all these Jews advocating for peace, they are considered as monsters to the brain, because this is something which is inconceivable for many minds. But then how can it all change? How can people just eventually side with peace? My parents changed their views once we got Arab Muslim neighbors. They would still say all Arabs are bad, but they would say except these guys. And this is something I've proven through my research, even with Muslim charities and the council in France, how they stop being Islamophobic is when people meet face to face. Because my theory is that it reconnects this empathy circuit in the brain that was broken or non-existent in the first place. Instead of seeing an abstract entity, the brain recognizes, oh, a fellow human being. And this is what happens with all these people. You may have heard, oh, I hate all black people, but except these guys. I hate all Muslims, except these guys. But unless you have these life experiences that lead you to question your reality, your comfort, it is very, very difficult for the human brain to just, do the work itself. So what to do with people who do not want to change, who are not open to conversations, who are not open to facts? You cannot convince people just like that. They have to be willing to do the work themselves. And this is something really heartwarming that I've noticed in the comments, is that, there are people out there who might be open to facts, to a conversation, to change their mindset. It might seem something very obvious for us, but I was surprised at the amount of comments of people realizing that, thank you, I've realized that not all Jews are the same, not all Israeli citizens are the same. And if you read the outpouring of love under this video about the Network Carta from people who identify as Muslims, it is just, you realize that although we are surrounded by so much news of hate and stuff, the majority of people actually, we are all thirsty for peace.
I want to show other Jews, I encourage them to come out here. You can come with your kippahs and you'll face nothing but love from the people here.
Sadly, those who advocate for hate and violence happen to be a minority, but a very vocal one, and this is why we have all these reactions here and there. One of the main factors for change happens through trust, and this kind of things only happens face to face. It is almost impossible for you to change someone just by typing comments online. And the same as hate is related to a breaking in the circuit of empathy in people's brains. When we summon empathy, it creates trust, and trust creates a fertile ground for many opportunities. It means that if you are debating with someone, if you're having a conversation, do not antagonize them. Empathize with them. Make them see that you side with them, you understand them. While if we antagonize, it triggers automatically this in and out group feeling in people, and no discussion is possible. If the person is not willing to change, you don't have to waste your time, but sometimes some of these discussions can lead to wonderful surprises. But then what do we mean when we advocate for peace? Because it's a very nice word, but what does it mean actually, peace in the region? Can there be peace without justice? Can there be peace without liberation from oppression? And if so, what does it look like? But this is a conversation for another time. In the meantime, I hope this video was useful. And again, take care of yourselves and each other.